Hi, I'm Josh McGrath.
I'm Andrew Haas.
And this is the Ardent Pursuit Podcast. In our last episode, we gave you 3 things we wanted you to do. Number 1, we wanted you to look around your community and see if there were any women that met your important and essential criteria. Number 2, we asked you to sit down with your authority or accountability and see, is there anyone in your community that they suggest you should be pursuing? And finally, number 3, to pray and process whether there were any women in your community that you should consider pursuing. Now, before we jump into today's topic, we've received a lot of great feedback from many of you. And some of the feedback that we've received really touches on this idea that we're not unpacking these ideas enough, that it's just really kind of high level and we just move beyond them really quickly. And there's a reason for that, because we want to unpack these ideas, but in order to do so, it would be a long form podcast where the episodes would be 45 minutes, 60 minutes, an hour and a half. And there are already a lot of podcasts out there that length. And we recognize that if we did that length, probably most of you wouldn't even listen. Maybe our moms.
We could talk for that long, but right.
Yeah,
you won't listen for that
no
long.
one wants to listen that long. So we've intentionally decided to go short and succinct, 25 to 35 minutes, which obviously means that we've got to breeze by topics at a very high level. Now, if you do want to hear a topic or a part of a topic, expounded upon, unpacked in greater depth, let us know. Send an email to contact@ardentpursuit.fm. And in the future, we'll do a specific episode where we unpack certain ideas in greater depth so that for those of you who are interested in knowing more, we're able to do that for you. All right, well, let's dive into today's episode. We're talking about today a bit of a controversial idea, the notion that men are called to lead in romantic relationships.
Yes.
And now, before all of our haters come knocking down our door and saying, yeah, they're coming for sure, saying that, no, women can't lead. We're actually not saying that women can't lead in other spheres. What we're saying is that God has specifically created men. It's his design that men lead when it comes to initiating, when it comes to leading romantic relationships.
It's something that all men are called to do. It's not about what you're gifted in. It's about what you're called to do. And here's the thing. For a lot of men, there will be other men more gifted than them. There might even be other women more gifted than them in leadership.
Yep.
That's not the point. It's not about gifting. It's about what you're called to. A lot of people might assume that leadership is a personality type.
Yeah.
It's actually not.
That is true. And for us, it's important that we look at this and examine this through a biblical lens. I think sometimes people are like, wait, why would you say that it's a man's job to lead in a romantic relationship? And to understand that, we actually need to go back to the beginning of Genesis chapter 2. The mandate that we see from God to Adam pre-fall, pre-sin, is to tend to the garden and keep it. And so it's this idea of bringing order and maintaining order. That was God's call and mandate for Adam. And then we see that sin enters, the fall happens. But the call doesn't change. The call remains the same to Adam. It's to bring order and to maintain that order.
Right. And just to be clear too, leadership, what's the tie-in to bringing order and maintaining order? It might not be, visible on the surface, but to lead well, you first need to live your own life with order. You need to be able to lead yourself well before you'll be able to lead externally.
It's true. And this is something that's very difficult for men to do. We talked about this, I think, with vision and purpose at one point. The idea that vision provides purpose in your life. And part of being a good leader, before you can lead others, you have to be able to lead yourself. And what does that look like, particularly if you're a single guy? That looks like being able to conduct yourself in a way where your life demonstrates that there is order. And that you're maintaining that order. So some practical examples. Things like keeping your room, your apartment, your house, whatever, clean and orderly. How often, the bachelor pad has a connotation for a reason. Why? Because oftentimes you walk into a single guy's room or apartment and it smells bad, it looks bad, it's terrible, it's not homey at all. And it's like, well, why? Well, because he's not bringing order to that space.
If he's not leading his own life well, he's going to be very challenged to lead in a situation that's involving another person.
Yes. I think about the fact that so often, you hear this from fathers who have daughters who are, of age to be married. And one of the things they'll talk about is they want to know if a potential future son-in-law, what his finances look like. What is that potential father-in-law looking at? Mm-hmm. He's looking at to see if that young man has order in his life, if he's maintaining order in his financial integrity. We actually talked about that. We talked about kind of the financial aspect of a guy's life.
Yep. Are your finances in order? Are your friendships in order? And, are you living a life that points to healthy order around you?
Yes. So now when it comes to bringing order, to establishing order in relationships, in romantic relationships, there's a lot of things that we could examine and look at, but there's actually 5 that we've identified that we consider probably the most important. While there could be many, we're just going to examine 5 today. So those 5 are communication, expectations, vision and purpose, emotions, and purity.
Yes, communication, very important for a guy.
Yep.
Men need to learn how to communicate well and how to communicate often.
Mm-hmm.
And something that's really important for guys to understand is the prerequisite for communicating well is actually listening well.
Yes.
If you're not a good listener, you aren't going to be a good communicator.
And we know that historically, men tend to not be great listeners. Mm-hmm. Now, 2 things I want to touch on here that I just want to unpack briefly. It's this idea of frequency and topics. I was actually speaking to a young man this past week. He's interested in pursuing a young woman. He hasn't acted on that yet. And so he was just talking about how in their friendship, he wants to make sure that he's communicating clearly. And so he wants to be careful about how personal the topics are that they're discussing, pre-entering a relationship.
Sure.
And I was just telling him a story from my life, throughout late high school, college, post-college, some of my closest friends were women. And in my mind, we were only ever friends. I was never romantically interested in them. And so, being a good listener, being a good communicator, it wasn't uncommon that we'd go out to lunch, to dinner, coffee, phone calls, emails, video chats, and they're just sharing about their life. And I'm asking these open-ended questions to get to know more about their life. And we're talking about, just personal things they're walking through in their life, in their family, relationally.
Watch out.
And I would do it frequently because a good friend is available. Proverbs 17:17, a true friend is always loyal and a brother is born to help in a time of need. And anytime there was need for conversation, I was there ready to talk with them. And it happened multiple times where eventually in our friendship, she would come to me and basically ask for clarity, wanting to define the relationship, wanting to know if we were going to the next level, so to speak, if we were officially dating. And I was always thrown off by that. I was like, what do you mean if we're dating? I was so clear. I never told you I was interested in you. I never said I wanted to begin anything with you. I never asked you out on a date. We only talked for hours and went out to coffee and movies and dinner and lunch. I don't know why you're reading into this.
In her head, things were playing out very differently.
Very differently. And I'm actually thankful for several very close female friends who kind of rebuked me in a very loving fashion and were like, Josh, you're actually a terrible friend to women. And I'm like, hang on, I'm an amazing friend to women. Look at all these women who I'm talking with all the time. And what they were saying was, what you're communicating by being so available in conversation, the frequency, and then the intimacy of the topics, the very personal topics that we discuss, that is like boyfriend, girlfriend status. Mm-hmm. That's not simply friend status. And I remember, kind of into my late 20s, learning this lesson with really close female friends and being like both disappointed in myself and frustrated with women because I was like, I don't understand. I'm just being a good friend. But realizing what I thought was being a good friend actually was communicating something very differently. And what happens so often for men in relationships, even unintentional relationships like I was in, is that they will, the topics that they're talking about and the frequency with which they're talking to a specific woman actually communicate something that maybe verbally they're not articulating.
Yeah, that's one of the tensions that guys will have to navigate. It's like you're going to want to be clear, or you might even try to be clear, maybe extra clear. But in that, you could be communicating something.
Something completely different.
Yes.
Yes, which is super interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just the tension that, a guy has to navigate. But I think this is very, very important that, like even the listen, we wrote here in our notes, listen, all caps.
Yeah.
But the reality is, yes, you do need to listen. But prior to establishing very clear, I'm pursuing you and I want to pursue you in this way, prior to that moment in that conversation, a man actually does need to be very careful that he's honorable in his interactions with women. And that might mean avoiding topics and avoiding certain frequencies of conversation and actually possibly listening less.
And that takes a certain amount of
Awareness.
Self-awareness, understanding the situation, know what you're getting into, know who you're talking to, know how far along you are in that journey. Guys need to be thinking about this and being proactive. Don't just enter into this and be like, oh, geez, I didn't know she would think that. Well, maybe not, but as a guy, you've got to purpose to do well in those areas.
Yes, because women want clarity. There is nothing more frustrating than operating in a relational lane where you're unsure of what you are. And so for a man to lead well, for him to communicate well, it's not enough to just say something, but your actions have to actually match up with what you're thinking inside. So if I'm thinking, I'm not in a relationship with this woman or I don't want to pursue her, guess what my actions have to do? They have to line up with that, which means not having those multiple, conversations a week and talking all about her life and asking her how she's doing.
And it's not good enough for a guy to think he's leading well or to think he's listening well. Or to think he's communicating well. Not good enough, bro. You've actually got to know that you're doing those things well. Because by definition, if you aren't doing those things well, you're placing a burden on her to fill that gap, to do that well.
Yeah, for her to bring clarity to that.
Yeah, and she very well may. But that's not an expectation or a burden that you should intentionally be placing on her. Do what you can to offload that burden. You handle that. And so she doesn't have to.
Absolutely. Now, looking here at number 2, expectations. So we're talking again about men bringing order, establishing order in a romantic relationship when it comes to expectations. So I want to start here with this idea of boundaries and behaviors. It's so important that from the outset of any type of romantic relationship, that the man establish what the boundaries and behaviors are going to be within that relationship. And obviously, those boundaries and behaviors will include things like, paying for things, time spent with each other, time spent with family, physical interaction. All of that has to be established by the man up front, because that actually helps to provide clarity for her on what her expectations are.
Yeah, a guy won't necessarily define the totality of the boundary, but he's going to lead in what that starts to look like. And what a lot of guys do, unfortunately, is they'll wait for her to define where things are at, or they will sort of they'll merge or morph into where her boundaries are. And kind of use that. They'll rely on her to establish certain boundaries and criteria. And it's like, no, you lead in that. You start to move toward what good boundaries are, and you'll get input along the way.
Yeah, and we see that specifically often when it comes to the physical interaction between a man and a woman. Now, that's point number 5 here, purity. We'll get to that here in a second. But I want to examine some other, non-physical, boundaries that need to be established up front. When you're initiating a romantic relationship, it is important for you to spend time with each other's families. It is important for you to spend time with each other's friends groups. That is very important. They need to see and meet you, the guy, in her community, and she needs to spend time with you so that your community gets to know her. However, you've got to be wise in how much time you're spending in either community. Why? I've seen it before that, she'll be like, hey, if you love me, if you care about me, you'll only hang out with my friends group. You'll only spend time with my family. And so she doesn't want to make the investment in getting to know his community or his family, or vice versa. And that becomes very unhealthy because what you begin to do is establish a status quo where my community or my family doesn't matter, or her community, her family doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so then the requirement is, if we're going to be together, it's going to look like this. And it's very, very, very unhealthy for a man to be pulled out of his community or for a woman to be pulled out of her community throughout the relationship process.
They've got to be involved in both. And actually, parallel to this, I was talking to someone not too long ago about this idea of spending time with someone you're interested in the presence of other people.
Yes.
Very important.
Talk about that more, because people oftentimes in our culture don't think about doing that.
Well, the comment made was, well, what if there aren't people to spend time with? Because I made the comment, you should spend time with the person you're interested in around people who know you.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? It would seem like common sense to a lot of people, but not everyone.
And it seems easy on face value.
It seems easy. So I said, spend time with her around people that know you. And he said, well, what if nobody knows me? Ooh. So that is actually the prerequisite. You first, if you don't have people that know you, you've got to first do some work and build some friendships and some relationships, platonic, with other men that know you. Once you have that established, that sets you up in a much better place to actually bring in an interested person.
It's funny because I will oftentimes tell men who are pursuing a woman, hey, the majority of your time together should be spent serving your community. And there's this notion that you need alone time.
No, you don't.
Yes, spend time with other people, but you should be spending most of your time on you. And that, I would argue, tends to develop some of the most unhealthy outcomes.
Some of the questions that come up, or the big question that comes up is, well, how am I going to get to know the other person?
Yes.
And it's like, really? You think spending alone time is going to show you who that person is? Mm-hmm. Of course they're going to be amazing.
Yes.
It's just the two of you. There's no other responsibilities.
Literally.
There's no other burdens placed on them.
Yeah.
They better be perfect. If they're not,
get out. It's true. And whereas when you spend time within a community setting, one of the things you get to observe about each other is, how do they interact with other people? How do they serve other people? Mm-hmm. How do they handle the stresses of maybe in an environment where there are more people together? That will tell you a lot about a person.
Yes.
And so an example I think of right now is how, like, when you're alone together and you say you do dinner together at your house, her house, whatever, which, you shouldn't be doing, but let's just say you do. And she gets up and she does the dishes, or he gets up and he does the dishes. I'm like, oh, there's like two of you. NBD, who cares? Like, you don't get an applause for that. Now you're in a community setting where there's like 15 people having dinner together.
Wow, do the dishes
and then she gets up and does the dishes, or he gets up and does the dishes then. And I'm like, all right, well done. I see you. I see you. Like that's impressive. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to see that in an environment where it's only ever the two of you together.
Yep, very, very important. Not just her friend group, not just your friend group. If there are separate friend groups, that's okay, but the goal eventually is there should be at some point a friend group that the both of you are a part of.
Yes, and you should both be investing in each other's families. Mm-hmm. And I understand the dynamic of the family structure these days can be complicated, right? Unfortunately, many families are broken, and while all families are dysfunctional, the question is on just how dysfunctional, right? And so some families may be more dysfunctional than others, and so it can be easy to say, look, your family has more problems than mine. Therefore, we're just going to limit our time investment in your family. And I'm like, of course you have to use wisdom. Of course you have to, examine objectively what that process is going to look like. Mm-hmm. But to just default to a place of saying my family's better, therefore we're only spending time with my family, is very unhealthy, because the reality is this. We've talked about this before. Every relationship should be headed towards a decision, covenant or not covenant.
Yeah.
And so if you are headed towards covenant, and you do actually walk in that, guess what? Your children, your offspring are going to want to know their grandparents on both sides. Mm-hmm. So the investment you're making into that family relationship right now will pay dividends and will provide a harvest down the road for your children.
And navigating all that takes work, but guess what? You got to do the work.
Yep. Yeah, men are called to do that. Welcome to Leadership 101.
That's right.
Spelled W-O-R-K.
That's right.
All right, so point number 3 here, vision and purpose.
Yes, having vision for the relationship requires good boundaries, but it's going to require good leadership to ultimately bring her into everything, because you're not just presenting something to her.
Yeah.
This is something that both of you are going to be involved in.
Yeah, and so together you want to establish what is the vision and purpose of this relationship. Because if you're coming at this from the perspective of, hey, I want to see this leading either to covenant or not covenant, but she's coming at this saying, hey, I think you're fun to hang out with. Very different visions. Very different purposes to that relationship. And so you want to make sure that together you're establishing that vision, that together you have the same purpose for why you're entering into a romantic relationship.
And make sure you own the boundaries you set, and make sure the vision that you're casting is your own.
Yes, exactly. Because you don't want to be casting a vision that other people have for you. You want to let ultimately the Bible inform your vision and your purpose. And what's the Bible say about the purpose of romantic relationships? Well, they should be leading to either covenant or not covenant. And it's important, we talked about this in episode 6, to have authority and accountability. We're not going to rehash that whole thing. Go back, listen to episode 6, but that's very, very important in helping to not only establish the proper vision and purpose of a romantic relationship, but ultimately to maintain it.
Yeah, so important.
All right, so number 4 here, emotions. All right, I feel like every time, ironic, I just said feel, that we talk about emotions, we have to put that disclaimer out there that while emotions are real, they're not always true.
Yes, they can be misleading.
They absolutely can be misleading. And so much of our culture today is informed by how they feel about something. I love what famed author and public speaker Ben Shapiro says. He said, facts don't care about your feelings.
No, they don't.
Facts transcend feelings. And so while emotions are valuable and important, we've talked about this before, God created them. They make great servants, terrible masters.
Yes.
And so part of when it comes to establishing order in a relationship is first and foremost, you as the man establishing that you are not going to be overly emotional. You're not going to be overly dramatic about this relationship. And what helps cut down on the emotion and the drama in any relationship is clarity. It's that communication, that first element we talked about. It's also about vision and purpose, knowing what the vision and purpose of that relationship is. That's going to decrease the amount of drama and emotion that's happening in a relationship.
Yeah, emotions play a really good role in helping to figure out what's going on.
Yes.
But they're really bad at dictating what should happen. And guys need to be better versed in practicing that. We should be good at using the emotions around us, using our own emotions to sort through what we're facing, but ultimately using emotions to move forward, to figure out, I'm going to go this way or this way based on emotions. That's dangerous.
I think it is important while we're talking about emotions that men are not afraid to express emotions.
Absolutely.
But you don't need to cultivate being emotional.
Yes.
And while some men, many men are emotional, generally on the rage and anger side of the spectrum.
Yep.
We need to keep that in check. But the counterbalance to the rage and anger is not to then become like emotional and crying about everything.
Yes. Right. Or even to scale back, you think, oh, he's too emotional, he's too angry. The answer to that isn't nothing.
Exactly.
So many guys just kind of go back to zero.
Yes. And they end up being stoic, they're Spock from Star Trek, they just don't show emotion. I'm like, no, it actually is really important for men to show emotion, but healthy emotion, to show natural emotion, to show masculine emotion. That's actually really important.
Yes.
And one of the things that men tend to struggle with in a relationship that causes emotions to run high, both in her or him, is to escalate kind of the emotional tension based upon something she says or does, or something people around them say or do. And so she responds in an emotional way, so he heightens it up, and then she responds more emotional, and then he responds more emotional, and next thing you know, it's this big drama thing, and it's spilling all over, and you got Facebook statuses of people being all angry and emotional. What the man's job is to do is, if she is getting emotional, is not to respond emotionally, but to help ground her and that moment in theology, in logic, in reality, in a way that is helpful and God honoring to her.
Yeah, take those emotions that she's feeling, take the emotions that you might be feeling, use that to inform the situation, but move forward in a way that's de-escalated or in a less heightened emotional state.
Yes.
That's the goal.
And part of what will help all of this is to make sure that you're having emotionally mature conversations and interactions. Again, kind of going back to that vision and purpose, those two things will help set the tone and tenor of your relationship.
Yeah, emotions are not bad, but if they're used to drive the conversation or if they're used to drive the situation forward, that's dangerous.
Yes, it is. Okay, so number 5 here, purity.
I'm triggered. Proceed slowly.
You know, for any of our listeners who grew up in a Christian household in the 90s and early 2000s, I'm sure there's some baggage associated with this term.
There will be.
I'm sure someone somewhere is burning an I Kiss Dating Goodbye book right now as we speak.
Book burnings solve a lot of problems.
Yes. So I recognize, we recognize that this is a term that does need to be unpacked, right? For our listeners who didn't grow up in a Christian household, they might be familiar with the term, but not really understand the nuances of it. And probably some of our listeners today are hoping for a very concrete, succinct, clear definition of the term purity. Guess what? We're not given it. This is something that really would require its own whole episode. Today's episode's already very long. And the reality is this. What we're talking about here is the idea of male leadership within a relationship, and the fact that men are called to establish order, to bring order, and then to maintain order. And we've talked about this before. Part of being a good leader is not just doing what other people tell you to. So if our listeners are hoping we just tell them what purity is, what it is not, well, that's not what they're going to get from us, because we actually want to challenge our listeners. We want to challenge the men listening to us to actually define for themselves what purity is. If they're a believer, if they're a Christian, to go back to Scripture, to sit down and with authority and accountability and to define for themselves, what does purity look like? And if they're not a believer, for them to examine through maybe a cultural lens, a relational lens, what would purity look like for them?
And it's less about what it is, and it's more about the 1,000 things that it's not.
Yes.
So we're not going to list all the things that it's not, but as a guy, that's kind of how you want to approach it. What are the things I shouldn't be doing? Yes, you have a goal in mind, but it's less about if I do these things, that meets the definition. It's more like, hey, watch out. Don't do all these other things.
Absolutely. And we know this. This could be a very long episode.
Yes.
Just discussing the concept of purity. Maybe we'll get there at some point. That would be a fun episode. But today we're just talking about this briefly. So the question I have is, what does it look like to lead well in the area of purity when it comes to a relationship?
Well, to start, it's about taking responsibility for yourself and for her. A lot of guys need to recognize that in a relationship, you need to take responsibility for your actions, but also take on some responsibility for how she conducts herself.
Yes.
Be willing to carry that burden and be able to steward that and lead through that. It's your job to set the standard. A lot of guys like to go to what her standard is at.
So often we actually see this with men. When it comes to, purity and what the standard is, they find out where the line is, so to speak, based upon what she's okay with. And so they'll attempt X, Y, and Z physically, sexually, and wait for her to push back and say no. And then for them, they're like, oh, that's the line. That's the standard that I need to have now, which is a completely unhelpful and unhealthy way of going about doing this. Because as a man, you should be setting the standard, and the standard should be very high for you and for her.
Absolutely. Take her input, right?
Of course.
She's going to have thoughts, desires.
Definitely.
Right? She's going to have her own expectations. Factor all that in. But as a guy, don't just rely on where she's at and have that be where things are at.
Completely. And one of the things that men tend to do is they tend to set themselves up for failure in this area. We've talked about this before, that men are sexually driven. And once you're in a relationship, we know this, objectivity goes out the window, and you're driven by a sexual desire for the woman you're in a relationship with. And so what you've got to do as a man is you want to set yourself up for success in the area of purity by making sure that the time that you're spending together, the location that you're hanging out, the activities that you're doing, that the things you're talking about, that you're setting yourself up for success in those areas. Like if you're staying up, at each other's, apartments till, midnight, watching Netflix by yourselves, probably not setting yourself up for great success versus, getting up at, 7 a.m. to go running together 5 miles downtown. So men need to set themselves up for success. And the irony is men are terrible in this area at setting themselves up for success.
And men need to realize that if you're a leader, you're also a protector. That involves protecting yourself, right? Protecting your mind, protecting your heart, very important, but also protecting her. And, you might think, well, if we end up married, then it's going to be great. Then it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter anyways. It's like pre-investment into our marriage.
But it's like, well, hold on. This isn't conditional.
It's true.
These aren't conditional parameters. If things continue to go this way, then everything's all right. It's like, no, you need to protect her for the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
What's the worst case scenario? And do things now to protect her and minimize the impact on her should that worst case scenario play out.
And, talking to couples who are married now, who maybe struggled in the area of purity in the dating phase, I've never spoken to a healthy couple who maybe struggled in that area. And they've said, I'm so glad that we did X, Y, Z before marriage. That's definitely strengthened our marriage. I've never heard that from them.
Never.
And so while someone might say, does it really matter if we're just going to end up married anyways? Yes, it does matter.
Yeah, it actually does.
You want to set your marriage up for success. Again, everything that we're talking about here, our goal is to equip men to set them up for success in marriage. That is the goal ultimately. And so if you want to have a successful marriage, you need to have a successful dating relationship. Well, how do you do that? By walking with integrity in the area of purity. The question is not how close to the line can I get, right?
Yep.
You and I have, walked with many a man through relationships, and we've had this question posed to us before, and it's like, that's the wrong question to be asking.
How far can I go and still be appropriate?
Yes.
It's like, nope, wrong question to ask.
That is absolutely the wrong question to ask. What we want you to do, what we want men to do, is to look at that as an opportunity to lead with a standard that isn't saying how close to a line can I get, but actually what does it look like to walk with purity? What does it look like to walk with integrity? What does it look like to honor her, regardless of the outcome of the relationship, whether we end up married or we end up not married?
And you're not going to find a definition of this from any one person or any place, actually.
I mean, some people may try to give it.
They'll try to give it.
Yeah, whoa, red flag.
Watch out. We're definitely not going to give a definition for it. Because the goal is, as a guy, you've got to figure this out.
Yeah.
Like you've got to put in the time, put in the thought process, put in the effort to actually figure out, okay, what's best for this situation? What's best long-term if things go well or if things don't go well?
Yes.
You want the best outcome in the future, no matter what the condition is.
Yeah, set yourself up for success. And men don't do that often. But that's why we advocate so strongly for accountability and authority. The accountability and authority is what will help set you up for success in the area of purity, as well as many other areas. And obviously, final thought here, because we got to close this episode out. Purity is weird in our culture. The idea of treating a woman with honor, integrity, and purity in a romantic relationship, while it sounds great on face value, culturally, that is weird. And in fact, we're probably going to get the haters who are going to come on here and say, you don't know what you're talking about. The irony, right? They're all like, anti-women is what these people are. They're like, no, absolutely, you should take advantage of women. Absolutely, you shouldn't be pure. You shouldn't respect them. I'm like, you guys are terrible. And so you will be criticized. You will be looked at weird.
Absolutely.
I've seen it as I've walked with other men before through the relationship. The idea that maybe that they're not kissing before marriage, or that they're not holding hands, that they're not having sex before marriage, that they're not living together before marriage. And culturally, people look at that and say, that's weird. That can't work. That's awkward. But
Yeah.
in reality, it's those things that set up a couple for the best success when it comes to a marriage.
And not only does culture look at you weird, often there's even pushback. It's not even,
That is
okay,
true. That is
you
true.
can do that weird thing if you want.
Yep.
Go for it. That doesn't make sense to me. It's not just that. It's
There's pressure to engage more sexually.
right.
Wait, you're not gonna have sex before marriage? How do you know she's gonna be the right one? I'm like, well, what type of question is that? Like, marriage is so much more than just sexual gratification. And from the Christian perspective, you're recognizing that marriage is a significant institution that's a representation of Christ's relationship with the church. And so we're going to advocate that when you enter into a relationship, you're entering into it with sobriety, with vision, with purpose, something that's so much bigger than just you and your gratification.
Yep.
And that is countercultural in 2024.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got to stop here. Believe it or not, we actually still have like half an episode to go, and this one is already probably our longest episode yet. So if you feel like we've left you hanging, we have. Don't worry, we're gonna come back here. We're gonna we don't even have time today to finish this episode. So we're gonna have to come back here. We're gonna have to record part 2. We'll get it out, but we have no homework for you as a result of only making it halfway through this episode. So we will see you here next time.